also remain relevant to the present day. As each age faces the challenge of new epidemic diseases, from cholera to tuberculosis to AIDS, SARS, bird flu, and Ebola, plague remains a paradigm against which reactions to other epidemics have been judged. But plague strategies were also based on the long tradition of sanitary legislation in the European medieval city, even if contemporaries may have exaggerated the extent of the cleanliness of the streets, as in Leonardo Bruni's panegyric to the city of Florence, and I quote, "Indeed, it seems to me that Florence is so clean and neat that no other city could be cleaner. Surely this city is unique and singular in all the world, because you will find here nothing that's disgusting to the body or the eye, offensive to the nose, or filthy underfoot. The great diligence of its inhabitants ensures and provides that all filth is removed from the streets, so that you only see what brings pleasure and joy to the senses." Now, given the close association in contemporary beliefs between filth, smell, and disease, it's not surprising that contemporaries and subsequent historians of public health should have built on the tradition of civic pride and maintained that the first effective plague measures were developed in Italy. Thus, just as the Renaissance was seen by Italians at the time as gradually civilizing countries north of the Alps, so did the influence of their administrative reactions to epidemic disease. Indeed, governments in 16th century England associated civility with the measures taken by Italian health authorities against plague. Now, the main focus of this lecture is plague in Florence, a topic, of course, made famous by Giovanni Boccaccio's detailed description of the impact of the Black Death on the city in his introduction to the Decameron, and although it's a cliché, I shall quote it. "I say then that the sum of 1,348 years have elapsed since the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God, when the noble city of Florence, which for its great beauty excels all others in Italy," note campanalismo like Bruni, "was visited by the deathly pestilence. In the face of its onrush, all the wisdom and ingenuity of man was unavailing. Large quantities of refuse were cleared out of the city by officials specially appointed for the purpose. All sick persons were forbidden entry, and numerous instructions were given for the safeguarding the people's health, but all to no avail. Nor were the countless petitions humbly directed to God by the pious, whether by means of formal processions or in any other guise, any less ineffectual." Now, this account has become part of the collective memory of late medieval plague, and despite its literary nature, it did broadly reflect some of the secular and spiritual strategies adopted by Florence, which were developed further to become the basis of the city's public health policies. The introduction has retained its iconic status, comparable to the much later and longer accounts of the last epidemics of plague to affect Milan in 1630 and London in 1665, respectively by Alessandro Manzoni and Daniel Defoe. Now, this lecture will concentrate principally on the 17th century, and like Boccaccio, Manzoni, and Defoe, will examine plague in 1 year in one city, Florence in 1630 to 31, which was the last epidemic to affect the city, although it did return briefly in 1633. But my main theme is the role of religion and the spiritual strategies adopted by the church, although I want to begin briefly by looking at the secular strategies of Florentine governments in order to combat the plague. All this will be developed, as Peter said, in a much greater detail in the monograph I'm completing for Yale. Following on from the books of Anne Carmichael on plague in Renaissance Florence and Giulia Calvi on the court cases of the 1630 epidemic, I want to present an account from the perspective in this book as I'm writing, of the government and the government. Indeed, such is the richness of the material that enables one to recreate the impact of this epidemic crisis at the levels of neighborhood, street, family, and individual. The study of the neighborhood and the relationship between neighbors, and by extension the relationship between neighborhood and politics, was one of the main interests of Bill Kent. In common with a wide range of studiosi of Florentine history, I was inspired by Bill's enthusiasm, his humanity, and his brilliance, and I'm honored to have been asked to give this lecture in this series. Over the years, our paths crossed many times in Florence, and particularly in the ambiente of Harvard's memorable Villa Ritati. But our connection goes back even further, for I had the fortune to share with Bill and Dale Kent the same doctoral supervisor in London, Nikolai Rubinstein. I hope that Bill would have liked what follows, and he would have been able to see the extent of his influence on my work, first in my first book on poverty and charity in late medieval Florence, and also in my forthcoming study then, which extends my earlier interests in the structure of charity and how the poor survived in a pre-modern city, and in particular, how individuals and society coped with the impact of a major epidemic. So I want now to turn to the actions and the reactions of the Florentine state to the epidemic, and I'll begin with a quotation. The plague was, citing one medical writer, quote, an infection of the heart generated by poisoned air. Others have said that it's a contagious sickness caused by the infection of the air, or of the corruption of those things which breed it. Others say that it's God's punishment or God's war, which human power cannot resist, and others that the plague is a poisonous vapor in the air and inimical to man's vital spirit. So this is an extract from the treatise written in autumn 1630 by the Chancellor of the Health Board in Florence, Fulvio Giubetti, who recorded both medical and religious explanations which were believed to have been the cause of the epidemic, from infection of the air to divine punishment, reflecting to a surprising degree the views expressed in Boccaccio's introduction to the Decameron. This dual explanation remained a theme throughout the epidemic, which between August 1630 and the following year, July, was responsible for the death of some 11% of the Florence's resident population of 75,000 people. This was actually quite a low rate of mortality compared with other cities in northern Italy in this period, when epidemic has appeared in the autumn of 1629, and it led to the death in Milan of 46% of its population of 130,000, 24% of Bologna's 62,000, and 57% of Verona's 53,000. Fulvio Giubetti goes on in his treatise to outline the types of measures put into effect to combat plague, and they can be divided into two main types: preventative measures to stop plague breaking out, and then, if these didn't work, measures to combat the plague once it had entered the state and then the city, all coordinated by the health board or the Magistrato di Sanità. Preventative strategies included the imposition of cordons sanitaires along the borders of whole states, manned by soldiers who checked health passes and challenged and even shot those who attempted to cross the border without authorization. These measures then can be characterized as the administration of physical medicine of the body of the city. This was predicated on prevailing medical theory with the basic assumption that plague derived from the atmosphere and was formed by poisonous vapors generated by corrupt matter, such as stagnant water in bogs or the effluents generated by humans living in close proximity. This led to measures designed to cleaning up the environment, and by the early 17th century to sanitary surveys to identify and remedy the source of stink. But there were also a close link between the body of the city and the individual body, since it was believed that people, and especially the poor, could generate plague through living in insanitary conditions and eating food of poor quality, since the food of poor quality corrupted their humors, which then corrupted their breath. Indeed, according to one contemporary physician, Antonio Righi, who advised the health board, it was in the very nature of the poor to attract disease. He likened the noble and robust organs, such as the heart, to the upper levels of society, and the poor to the less noble and robust organs, veins, arteries, skin, and glands. The former were seen of having the ability to expel unnecessary dangerous substances out towards the outside and the lower organs. The latter, the poor, didn't possess the same ability, as they became the depositories of poisons. Quote, therefore, if the disease is in the city, they, the poor, receive it and retain it as though they were the glands of society. It was then from the recognition of the necessity to prevent the spread of corrupt air that derived all the well-known proactive measures taken by Italian governments once plague had been declared as present in the city. These included the banning of public assemblies, the prohibition of the sale of cloth, the disinfection of clothes and goods of plague victims, the inspection and the treatment of the sick and their burial in special plague pits, and also the isolation of the sick in special plague hospitals or lazzaretti outside the city walls. Humph. Can somebody help how I move the... Thank you very much. So this is San Miniato al Monte, which you don't normally associate with a lazzaretto, but in fact it became the main lazzaretto of the city in the 1630 to 31 epidemic. Now in Florence, was the fraternity of the Misericordia, which was central to these measures. Its members and employees picked up and carried those sick with plague to the lazzaretti and the dead for burial in extramural plague pits. This contemporary painting, probably by Luigi Baccio del Bianco, shows the Misericordia in action outside their headquarters in Piazza del Duomo. It presents a view of the cathedral with its unfinished facade from the west to provide the maximum canvas to depict the confraternity at work and underline the importance of its charitable role. They were shown dressed in a black habit with a black felt hat, in contrast to the red clothes of the patrician classes, doctors and priests, as well as you can see a serving woman in the mid-distance. This picture then represents the combined motivation of charity and disease control, which drove secular reactions to the plague and provides a necessary context for understanding religious strategies, to which I now want to turn. If these public health measures can be seen as physical medicine in action, then spiritual medicine to treat the body of the city was equally, if not more important. Religious reactions can be divided into preventive strategies and those devised once plague had broken out. These evolved around two major mendicant convents, the Servite Church of Santissima Annunziata and the Dominican Observant Church of San Marco. They became the main spiritual centers of the city on which Florentines concentrated their attention for salvation in 1631. And as we shall see, thus became important centers for artistic patronage. In each case, these churches were at the center of major public processions, the first to Santissimo Annunziata in August 1630, and the second to San Marco 4 months later in December, and I'll examine each in turn. Let's begin then with the preventive strategies adopted by the church. Initially, as plague threatened in August, the Archbishop of Florence, Monsignore Marzi Medici, passed a series of decrees to ensure the spiritual health of the city and ward off the threat and impact of God's anger. He decreed that sermons should be given every Sunday in the Duomo by representatives of all the main religious orders. Their common theme was that these punishments, the flagelli di Dio, came as a result of our sins. For a whole year, the Holy Sacrament was to be exposed on the high altar of the cathedral, and in front of it, the devotion of the 40 ore, the continuous prayer for 40 hours, should take place not just in the Duomo, but also in the churches, the monasteries, the congregations, and the confraternities of the city. He then ordained that the bells of the Duomo and all the churches of the city should be rung together 15 to 20 times for the Ave Maria dei Morti, a relatively recent devotion when the public recited the De Profundis for all souls in purgatory. According to one contemporary quote, "And when this sound was heard, everybody, the poor and the rich, must kneel together at the same time wherever they found themselves, and with an act of contrition and pain for their sins, they should turn to the Lord, praying for their liberation from the said tribulation. Indeed, we truly saw a great devotion among many in the streets and shops of the city." Then, in mid-August, the archbishop made a vow to the Virgin of Santissima Annunziata on behalf of the whole city to fast 1 day a week for a year, to be undertaken by one person in each household, beginning on the 15th of August, the festival of the Assumption of the Virgin. The Madonna of Santissima Annunziata was a natural choice for the vow given the church's long-standing role as one of the main miracle shrines in Florence, making it an important centre in the city's fight against disease, whether this was plague or the more private ills and misfortunes of individuals. The Archbishop's instructions had been spelt out in a public sermon in the Duomo by a father of great value. And following the sermon, there was a public procession to Santissima Annunziata. They began at the Duomo with, quote, "all the clergy, with our most pious Ferdinand, Grand Duke of Tuscany, all his relatives, with leading members of the government." This, unfortunately, didn't help the Archbishop himself. Following an illness which lasted for a number of days, he died on the 13th. The day following the procession, the 16th of August, an elaborate public funeral was organised, which was attended by a large crowd. Even if the Archbishop didn't die of plague, and this was not mentioned at the time, the day of his funeral fell on the feast day of San Rocco, one of the main plague saints. 2 days later, the theme of the public sermon delivered in the Duomo by a member of the barefooted Carmelites was that the Archbishop's death was a punishment for the sins of the Florentines. In fact, as the contemporary Grossieri Luca di Giovanni di Targioni comments, this appeared to have been verified because within a few days the male contagioso had broken out in Trespiano, a small village about 5 miles north of Florence on the road to Bologna. So these then represented the preventative measures, the spiritual measures administered by the Church, based on very public displays of penitence, with large numbers of people mixing together. However, as pious as members of the Public Health Board may have been, as plague grew worse in late August, such public religious activity was frowned on, since it was seen as potentially spreading plague. Indeed, the new Archbishop, Cosimo Bardi di Conti di Vernio, implemented new policies more in line with the Health Board's wishes, since he had had experience of plague epidemics in other parts of Italy. So he banned processions and public sermons, and also issued a series of instructions to parish priests to stress their obligations and the necessity to take precautions for their own safety. They were to continue living in their parishes and administering the sacraments of penitence, the Eucharist, extreme unction, and baptism. However, when hearing the confession, priests were told to keep the popolo at a distance, and a curtain of parchment was hung in the confessionals to create a barrier between them so that the breath of any sick person would not infect the confessor. Thus, by early autumn 1630, it's striking that in Florence, in contrast to earlier periods and indeed in other cities in other parts of early modern Italy, there seemed to have been little conflict between church and state reactions to plague, between the former who wanted to encourage processions to assuage the ire of God, and the latter who opposed any occasion that led to a large number of people assembling. Evidently, both sides understood that crowds increased the risk of corrupt air, which was seen at the time, as we've seen, as the cause of plague, whether breathed out by those with plague or their contacts. However, what is intriguing is that by early December, the necessity to invoke a heavenly patron was so strong that both church and state agreed to organize another major public procession. By early December, the Health Board announced that mortality from plague was diminishing, so a new public procession was organized by the church in celebration, at the centre of which was the uncorrupted body of St. Antoninus, the 15th century Archbishop of Florence, who was carried from San Marco along Via Larga to the Duomo. The saint's body was housed in the Dominican church of San Marco in the Salviati chapel, designed and constructed by Gian Bologna and its associates between 1579 and 1591. It was the final concrete embodiment of the process of Antoninus' canonization, promoted by Pope Adrian in 1523 and published by the Medici Pope Clement VII. St. Antoninus was seen as the city's defender and protector, whose role it was to intercede on behalf of his subjects to mitigate the effects of God's anger against Florence. His help had only come to be invoked in such a public way in the 17th century, beginning with the famine of 1622. This new role is reflected clearly in Stefano della Bella's drawing of Sant'Antonino protects Florence, which was probably produced in relation to the epidemic of 1630 and before he left for Rome in 1633. Seated on a cloud and floating above the city, Antoninus stretches out his arms and his cloak, extending his patronage and protection to the city. The clear association with the Grand Duke is reflected on the front left in the puto carrying the ducal crown, while balancing these emblems on the right, there are those of Florence itself, the Marzocco lion, and the personification of the river Arno. The joint secular and ecclesiastical campaign is reflected in the reference to cannons of war and angelic trumpets, underlined by the clear representation of both the Duomo and the Palazzo della Signoria. Antonino's relevance as a protector against plague was emphasized by his active role in providing physical and spiritual succor to the sick and dying during the epidemic of 1448-9. This role is depicted in one of the frescoes in the lunettes in the Chiostro di Sant'Antonino in San Marco, a cycle of the life and miracles of Sant'Antonino Pirozzi, begun in the early 17th century and finally completed in the 1690s. Although Pietro Dandini's fresco of Sant'Antonino and the plague of 1448-9 was not painted until 1693, this subject may very well have been envisaged as part of the original iconographic scheme, given that his help to plague victims was part of his hagiographic tradition. The continued relevance of the subject in the 1690s reflects then current preoccupations with epidemic disease, as Florence was suffering from a severe epidemic of fevers, probably typhus. The fresco shows the saint providing the viaticum to a dying plague victim. The inscription underneath the fresco stresses both his spiritual and charitable role. Quote, he administered the Holy Sacrament and helped the needy with generous alms. This reflects his interest in the respectable poor, or the poveri vergognosi, for whom he'd established the confraternity of the Buonanima di San Martino in the 1440s. The theme of saintly figures administering the last sacrament to the dying became one of the most popular subjects in post-Tridentine plague imagery. The new emphasis on the sacraments reflected the Roman Catholic Church's broader propaganda campaign against the Protestant challenge and rejection of many of the traditional sacraments. The influence of the Council of Trent on practices in Florence can be seen in Archbishop Cosimo de' Bardi's decrees in the autumn underlying the sacramental obligation of parish priests. The other feature of Dandini's fresco, which is shared by this new emphasis on the role of saintly care of the sick, was the setting in the open air, reflecting the role of some clergy in carrying the viaticum to dying plague victims, whether they were found in the street, at home, or in lazzareti. In Dandini's fresco, the sick man is showing as having collapsed on a pile of straw, probably representing the man's pallias, or mattress, typical of the houses of the poorer levels of society. Now, one of the most striking features of Dandini's fresco is the depiction of the large brown bubo under the left armpit of the plague victim. This way of representing the effects of plague is part of a long iconographic tradition, even though it's been observed that more generally, by the 17th century, fewer buboes were shown on the bodies of plague victims. The aim of showing the sick man's symptoms and the proximity of the clergy was probably didactic, to emphasize their role in tending to the sick despite the threat to their health, and to demonstrate the divine protection afforded them by Jesus, the divine physician, and of course Antoninus as a saint, who himself would have had no fear when confronted by a plague victim. Having emphasized the particular relevance of Antoninus during plague, let's return to the procession in August 1630. It was a major event in the life of the city and was recorded by a number of eyewitnesses, including the grossiere Luco di Giovanni di Targione, an anonymous account recently attributed to the Chancellor of the Sanità, and the official chronicler Francesco Rondinelli, who was the Grand Duke's librarian. The whole event was carefully organized in advance by both the ecclesiastical and secular authorities, conscious of the necessity to achieve a balance between spiritual and sanitary health. Concern was raised that because, quote, the devotion of the Florentines was great towards that saint, it was likely there would be large crowds of people in the streets, which was regarded as, quote, a dangerous thing in times of contagion. Care thus was taken to restrict the number of participants in the procession, which was limited to leading members of church and state. The popolo was not allowed to enter Via Larga or the piazza in front of San Marco or in front of the Duomo, where the procession passed. Instead, they were to watch from a distance, from corners which intersected with these streets and squares. Mounted guards were stationed at these corners to stop the enthusiasm of the popolo leading to a tumulto, a system which obviously worked well because our commentators remarked that, quote, everybody was well behaved. What they saw was indeed a splendid and well-orchestrated event, and Francesco Rondinelli added other details of the scene which make it even more vivid and introduce the sense of smell. Thus, as during the other religious festivals, carpets were hung from the windows of palaces along the way, and sweet-smelling herbs had been scattered along Via Larga and Via Martelli, to which was added the smell of perfumes being burnt from the doors of the houses to disinfect the air. The owners of the palaces which lined these streets held a privileged position, for they were allowed to watch the procession from their doors with their servants, all of whom, however, lit torches. Rondelli was clearly much impressed by the sights and smell, which he characterized as beautiful to see. The procession began with 4 men carrying a lit candle accompanying a large crucifix, followed by 7 descendants of St. Antoninus and the Dominican friars and clergy, who walked along singing litanies in honor of the saint. Next came St. Antoninus himself, probably not unlike the scene depicted by Domenico Cresti, Il Passignano, in his fresco The Procession of St. Antoninus of 1589-91, painted in the Cappella di Sant'Antonino in San Marco, where the procession is shown leaving the church and passing a conventual cloister. Antoninus' body was carried in relay by a succession of the privileged, while in the fresco his body was shown lying on top of the catafalque. In December 1630, he was apparently carried in the glass sarcophagus in which he was normally encased. He was taken from the church by 6 bishops, including the archbishop, into the piazza. From there he was carried by the canons of the cathedral, who may have been younger and perhaps more able to support the weight of the sarcophagus than the elderly bishops. Giubetti, who was also present, was particularly struck by the saint's appearance, quote, and afterwards there came the beautiful golden arch, covered with the clearest crystal, where the body of the most glorious saint lay, surrounded by roses and irises, as though he were asleep, dressed in pontifical robes, as though he indeed were alive. The saint was surrounded by the 12 members of the Bonum San Martino and followed by the Grand Duke Ferdinand and his relatives and leading members of the government, all carrying lit candles. Then, as the bells from the Duomo rang out and the procession passed, everybody knelt in prayer to their patron in thanks for the lessening of the plague and hope for its eventual disappearance. When St. Antoninus' body arrived in the cathedral, he was placed on a raised platform in the choir, surrounded by a series of lit candles, in splendid large silver candlesticks, adding to the lights of the numerous lit candles around the choir, which were, quote, impossible to count since there were so many. The splendid and elaborate occasion involved the highest representatives of state and church, and once all the offerings had been made, the archbishop began to celebrate Mass. The secular and ecclesiastical collaboration was again underlined by the next stage, which also brought the ceremony inside the cathedral outside to the popolo. At a sign from the archbishop, the bells of the cathedral began to peal, followed by those of all the churches in the city, and rounded off by the firing of cannons from the fortresses around the city. This was a sign to the popolo, for following the edict of the archbishop, every man and woman threw themselves down onto the ground where they stood and knelt and prayed to God, saying 3 times Pater Noster and Ave Maria. It was at this point that the saint left the Duomo and was carried back to his resting place in San Marco. In the judgment of one observer, Giubetti, quote, "This procession was one of the most beautiful festivals I've seen in my life, and it proceeded with such devotion and sentiment that one can only describe it with difficulty. I saw someone cry bitterly, whose eyelashes were perhaps dry at the loss of those dearest to him." It should also be underlined the whole event was staged to restore the confidence of the public in the efforts being made by the state to combat plague. The fact that the Grand Duke took part in the whole ceremony, and indeed hadn't left the city during the epidemic, also boosted his reputation. But it's in its role as a religious event that the importance lies in convincing the Florentines of the importance of divine intervention, mediated through St. Antoninus to stop the epidemic. Furthermore, while only a small privileged proportion of the population was actually allowed to take part in the procession, all Florentines did feel involved in the whole event, and it points to the power of faith as spiritual medicine. Contemporaries were convinced their prayers had been heard and that God had responded to their appeal, for as Giubetti recorded, the weather improved and the plague diminished. Stories circulated that St. Antoninus' intervention had had miraculous effects. One nun claimed that 400 people had been cured from plague, and the only person that died in the parish of only one person had died in the parish of San Marco. While the director of San Miniato did record a drop in the number of deaths at the Lazzaretto, in fact, overall mortality of those buried in the Campo Santi, the plague pits outside the city walls, didn't actually fall until January, well after St. Antoninus' procession and his subsequent intervention. It may well have perhaps been related to increase in cold weather. Indeed, plague continued until the following summer, and the epidemic reoccurred over the next couple of years, until the Madonna of Impruneta finally arrived and succeeded in quelling the epidemic. Now, the other major religious site in the spiritual battle against plague in the city was Santissima Annunziata. It had been the center of the public ceremony for the city's vow to the Virgin on the Feast of the Assumption, when a public procession, as we've seen, began and ended with leading members of church and state. Santissima Annunziata had also been the destination for those who'd recovered from plague. Cohorts of male and female ex-appestati were formed into a procession, which wound its way down the hill from San Miniato al Monte to the city, where they first thanked the Virgin for their recovery before returning home. Each was dressed in white, symbolizing that they'd been left behind the sin associated with the disease and now re-entered the city purified and healthy in body and soul. This was intended as a very public spectacle to demonstrate how medical skill and the power of the Virgin's healing could combine successfully in the war against plague. The association between Santissima Annunziata and the plague was part of a long-standing tradition, especially with the Cappella di San Sebastiano, at the center of which was Antonio Pollaiolo's famous painting of Sebastian. The earlier decades of the Seicento saw the patrons of the chapel, the Pucci family, embarking on a program of redecoration. In about 1608, they commissioned Giovan Battista Paggi to paint the second martyrdom of Sebastian on the left-hand wall. The scene shown was, according to Baldinucci, the moment, quote, when the holy martyr, on the order of the tyrant, was wounded with iron rods. It's significant that it was Sebastian's second rather than his first martyrdom which was depicted here. This is understandable, perhaps, given that Pollaiolo's painting was a central altarpiece in the chapel, and the Pucci may not have wanted a competing image of the first martyrdom. It was in front of this altar that, according to Rondinelli, the Servite friars celebrated Mass against plague during the epidemic of 1633. As well as performing a very public role in the spiritual campaign against plague, Santissima Annunziata was one of the main miracle shrines of the city the cult continued in its traditional role for the cure of individuals, even if public figures like members of the Medici family or important foreign dignitaries or rulers may have profited from the powers of the Virgin. This role provided the context within which individuals, from the powerful to the more humble, commissioned votive offerings, from whole chapels to small votive panels. The more private votive role of Santissima Annunziata continued through the plague, as can be seen from a record of the miracles performed at the shrine. The register mostly records cases from the later winter onwards, probably reflecting restrictions on the public visiting the shrine in order to prevent the spread of disease. It was no accident the first entry in the register to refer to plague was dated the 6th of March, 1631, which was the day after the total quarantine of the city had been lifted and therefore enabled people to leave their houses. Most of the other 9 miracles were from the following months. Given the role of Santissima Annunziata during the plague of 1630, the church appears to have benefited more than many Florentine churches from patronage during or in the aftermath of the epidemic. The association of the Medici and Santissima Annunziata had had a long history, had grown even more close under the Grand Dukes as they paid for restructuring of parts of the church interior and exterior. The plague of 1630 provided a new incentive for enriching the Madonna's chapel, and on the 25th of March 1632, the Grand Duchess Christina of Lorraine, for the Feast of the Virgin, commissioned 4 candlesticks and a crucifix, designed by Nigetti and produced by Pietro Tacca, 3 of which survive to this day in Santissima Annunziata. But the Medici were not the only family keen to make a significant mark on Santissima Annunziata at the time or shortly after the plague. One of the most important projects was the restructuring of the old chapel of San Rocco on the left of the nave. The chapel had recently been reduced in size because of the rebuilding of the organ immediately above it. On the 20th of December 1630, during the plague, the Servites gave the patronage of the chapel to the Venetian merchant Jacopo Palli, who is an existing patron of Santissima Annunziata. Palli commissioned the sculptor Bartolomeo Rossi to design and produce the elaborate neoclassical frame for the altar, and the chapel was consecrated in December 1632. He then went on to commission one of the best-known painters of the time, Cesare Dandini, to paint a major altarpiece, the Assumption of the Virgin and Saints Jacopo and Rocco, with a view of the city of Florence. It's a substantial painting, and I'm afraid the lighting makes it difficult to take a decent photograph, but its location in the church is to the left of the main altar. This area already had had a close association with plague since the chapel was dedicated to San Rocco. In the altarpiece, San Rocco stands to the right of the Virgin with his usual attributes, holding his staff and accompanied by his dog. A plague sore is shown prominently on his left leg, revealed as he knelt and his cloak had fallen back. He's balanced by San Jacopo on the left, a choice reflecting the patron's Christian name. Mary is represented in her role as intercessor in the act of praying to God for his mercy to mitigate the impact of plague, and his wrath at the failings of mankind. Florence is immediately recognized, framed on 3 sides by 3 saintly figures with the cathedral, baptistry, and the Palazzo Vecchio. When comparing religious reactions to plague in early modern Italy, most cities appealed to their patron saints and miraculous images, organized processions, and involved public prayers and fasting. There was a general consensus between the secular and the ecclesiastical authorities of the necessity to allow the citizenry to take part in public devotional activities, with variations between cities about the extent of their involvement. In Milan, during the plague of San Carlo in 1576, it was the archbishop himself who persuaded the health board to allow 3 processions to take place as the epidemic worsened in October. And even during the dreadful epidemic in Naples in 1656, the authorities made a public vow to Mary, asking for her defense against plague, and encouraged the full participation of the public at the height of the epidemic. In some cities in central Italy, more caution appears to have been taken. In Bologna, in August 1630, the governing authorities took a public vow to the Madonna of the Rosary, Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier, to ask for their intercession. The vow was not fulfilled, however, until the end of the epidemic, the 27th of December, on the festival of St. John the Evangelist, when a public procession was organized through the city and for which the leading artist Guido Reni was commissioned to paint his Paglione del Voto. But in Florence, as in Bologna, in contrast to Naples and Milan, the Archbishop and Health Board were more cautious. Both cities also agreed in advance to limit severely the number of those allowed to participate in processions, with only leading members of church and state taking part, while the rest of the population had to watch from windows, doorways, and street corners. Now, in what's gone before, it's evident how important was the role of devotional images during and immediately after epidemics of plague, whether as a center of cults or as commissions in celebration or gratitude to saints for mitigating or ending an epidemic. Studies of those pictures associated with plague in early modern Italy have suggested that there were fewer direct pictorial representations of the symptoms of the disease on the human body by the 17th century plagues. It's been argued the emphasis in plague iconography had shifted away from exclusive concentration on suffering and towards the efficaciousness of healing. Various reasons have been put forward for the reasons for this perceived shift, both religious and medical. Thus, the increased Tridentine emphasis on the role of the sacraments as the true path to salvation led to greater stress on representations of saintly persons administering the viaticum to the dying. This type of scene also emphasized the role of Christian charity, providing a convenient way to reflect the role of the new orders intending to the desperately sick, especially the Jesuits, the Camilliani, San Giovanni di Dio, and the Capuchins, as Sheila Barker has shown in relation to 17th century Rome. This shift in emphasis and iconography away from more traditional images of plague arrows raining down on individuals and cities towards representation of the sick being treated is thus seen as complementary and parallel to the renewed emphasis on the sacraments. This led as well to increased representation of the use of physical medicines, as in pictures of Tobias curing his father's blindness or the Good Samaritan tending to the sick traveller. It's been noted this period saw the greater popularity of the second rather than the first martyrdom of St. Sebastian, showing St. Irene and her assistants treating the martyred saint. In all these scenes, it's argued, the physical manifestations of disease assume less importance than the act of care and cure. This wider geographical picture, I think, helps to provide a broader context within which to assess how far Florentine plague iconography fits these changes identified for other parts of early modern Italy. Giovanni Pagliolo has examined these themes most thoroughly for Florence and in his study of Jacopo Vignale, the preeminent painter in Florence of scenes associated with natural disasters in the 1620s and 1630s, when the city suffered from a series of epidemics from typhus as well as famine and plague. As in Rome during the 1656-7 plague, the epidemic in Florence did have a profound impact on the patterns of commission, with emphasis placed on a range of important saintly intercessors. As mentioned above, Sebastian is the saint traditionally linked to plague, and there are a number of images of him commissioned in Florence and its immediate surroundings during the first 30 to 40 years of the 17th century. For example, Jacopo Vignale, Saint Sebastian and Rocco, was commissioned by the abbot of the Badia Ripoli towards the end of 1630 for the chapel dedicated to Saint Sebastian, which was built 100 years earlier during the last epidemic of plague in Florence in the 1520s. Sebastian, who was one among a number of saintly intercessors, was shown tied to a tree in the traditional image of his first martyrdom. The other heavenly saints include the Virgin Mary, Rocco, and Thomas, while another altarpiece Sebastian commissioned for the chapel at this time from the Vignali workshop showed the saint's second martyrdom. Sebastian continued to hold pride of place in Florence as he did across Italy, but he was far from being the only saint to be associated with plague. Witness San Rocco's presence in Vignali's altarpiece for the Badia and in Cesare Dandini's Assumption of the Virgin in Santissima Annunziata, both dating from late 1630 to early 1631 at the time of the epidemic. Saint Job was another saint invoked in these years, as reflected in Vignali's 1621 painting, Job visited by his friends, now in the Prague National Gallery. It's been argued that the picture is a meditation on human suffering, and the various sores on his body also reflect the sufferings of Florentines from typhus. But we should also not forget that Job was well known as the patron saint of those suffering from the great pox, which also produced sores on the body. Furthermore, the fact that his left-hand foot is not shown in detail may suggest it's been eaten away, a symptom of the advanced stages of the disease. Added to this is the smell associated with the victims, following a convention dating back to the late 15th century. The artist indicated this stench by showing a figure holding her or his nose. The representation of disease in this range of paintings commissioned in Florence and its immediate surroundings is related to more general topos, to underline the physical suffering of saints, a theme which is far from being diminished in this period. With the increased popularity of St. Sebastian's second martyrdom, emphasis was placed on the wounded body, an image which has been interpreted as a reflection of Christ's martyrdom, as it was more generally in the case of the representation of Christ following his deposition, as is clear in Jacopo Vignali's Christ showing to San Bernardo di Chiaravelli the wound on his shoulder caused by the weight of the cross. Commissioned in 1623 for the Florentine church of San Simone e Guida, Christ points with his left forefinger to the wound on his shoulder, while Bernard of Chiavalli and two angels look on with sympathy, but also participate in his sufferings. The sores or wounds act as an invitation to do penance for the sins of mankind, which was seen as causing the outbreak of the typhus epidemic. The emphasis on both physical suffering and the curative role of saints was clearly evident in another of Vignali's commissions, the 4 paintings for the pharmacy of San Marco, which had been newly redesigned in the early 17th century and commissioned between 1623 and 1630. Here, the aim was to reflect the Christian endorsement of the combined power of physical and spiritual medicine. These canvases are no longer in the premises of the apothecary shop, but have been relocated nearby in a corridor off the cloister of Sant'Antonino in San Marco. A theme which unites these 4 images is miraculous healing. In the first, Tobias, under the guidance of the richly dressed angel, is seen cutting out the fish's gall, which he will then place in the small ointment jar with a lid to his right. He will then take the gall to his father, Tobit, so that he can anoint his blind eye to restore his sight. In the second picture, the baptism of Constantine, one can see the richly dressed Pope Sylvester I baptizing Constantine with holy water, and thus freeing him from original sin. This scene reflects the power of the unguent of spiritual medicine, appropriate for the context of a pharmacy within an observant Dominican convent. The third is a much more shocking scene. It shows St. Agatha exposing her bloody chest to St. Peter after she'd had her breasts removed through torture. Her patient, martyred expression is matched by St. Peter's compassionate glance as he spreads unguent on the wounds, taken from a small phial which he holds in his right hand. It's a curiously intimate scene, and the aim is again to emphasize the power of physical and spiritual medicine administered by St. Peter. In the fourth picture, painted in 1630 during the plague epidemic, Vignali shows the Good Samaritan pouring ointment on the wounds of the sickly young man who, like plague victims, had collapsed at the side of the road. He's shown with a number of abrasions on his body, and he had already received some treatment because there is a bandage on his right-hand leg above his ankle. Giovanni Pagliolo, in his description of the picture, argues that the body covered with sores may very well have been a reference to the body of the plague victim. As pointed out above, a number of these paintings, in common with other of Vignali's commissions in the 1620s and 30s, make reference not just to plague, but more generally to other types of epidemic disease, such as typhus or the great pox. The role of these 4 paintings, then, was to advertise the power of these saints, and at the same time the healing role of the newly refurbished friar's pharmacy. It should be noted that a central message of each picture was the use of liquids or unguents, which would have been made up and stored in the pharmacy of San Marco, and receptacles for storing medicines are represented in some of the pictures. This underlines the importance of the process of treatment especially in the very specific context of the Dominican pharmacy, where Vignali would have been required to place emphasis on the curative properties of the medicines. However, here and elsewhere, disease continued to be represented in all its grim reality, as has been seen above in the wounds or sores on the bodies of both Job and Christ, as well as in the later fresco of Sant'Antonino's role during the plague in the cloister of San Marco. So to conclude, this survey of religious reactions to plague in the 17th century has shown how both secular and ecclesiastical powers coordinated their efforts to allow, on the one hand, the celebration of the spiritual intervention of saints and images, and on the other hand, to limit the spread of plague. The types of religious strategies adopted in Florence in 1630-3 were broadly similar to other cities and included processions, the recitation of both communal and individual prayers, devotion to miraculous sites, and the donation of votive images to express gratitude for the preservation of or survival from plague. However, there were differences in Florence compared with many other cities in the 17th century, since there appears to have been little conflict between church and state, and they don't subscribe to the belief in the necessity for the whole population to participate in public processions. Certainly, the authorities had had plenty of time to prepare for the arrival of the epidemic, given that it was first identified in northern Italy in 1629, and Florence was also fortunate in that plague didn't have such a devastating impact as elsewhere. The 1630-33 plague also led to considerable patronage of artists, sculptors, silversmiths, and architects. There were many themes represented which are part of a long tradition of intercessionary saints. These include the first martyrdom of Sebastian, with a saint shown according to tradition as a semi-clad youth, pierced by a number of arrows, to San Rocco showing the bubo on his thigh. Local Florentine holy figures also rose to prominence at the time, including Domenico di Paradiso and Sant'Antoninus. The latter in the fresco in the cloister of San Marco was shown providing the viaticum to the dying, reflecting the way Carlo Borromeo was depicted, and thus the Dominicans were able to promote Sant'Antonino as the Florentine equivalent of the Milanese saint. We also need to place these commissions within a broader chronological and geographical context. Thus, it's necessary to see the commissions made in 1630-1 in relation to the preceding and the subsequent decades, the 1620s and the 1630s, rather than just examining the plague years themselves. There are plentiful examples of representative diseased or wounded during the 1620s, when Florence was afflicted with a whole series of crises, while the post-plague period saw commissions completed which had been conceived during or indeed after the epidemic. Secondly, when placing Florence's experience of plague and its artistic production as a result of plague within a wider geographical context, we see that it conformed to and differed from other places. Iconographic themes in Florence and its contado did conform to some of the wider developments, with increased emphasis on both the role of saintly figures caring for the sick and on the administration of the sacraments, reflected in scenes of the Good Samaritan or Tobiolo, and the new emphasis on Sebastian's second martyrdom. However, as we've seen at both Santissima Annunziata and San Marco, and other examples can be cited in the surrounding countryside, emphasis was still placed on what might be regarded as the more traditional signs and symptoms of plague saints such as San Rocco and San Sebastian. Thank you very much.
John, thank you for a stimulating magisterial lecture. I suspect if I were to now call for questions, a sea of hands would arise. I would be confronted with an enviable choice. So instead, I suspect you should all be invited to join us for drinks and refreshments and to bombard John before he arrives at his first class with all the questions you may have. And